At a dusty horse auction, while the wealthy laughed and placed their bets, one broken Mustang stood forgotten in the corner, skinny, scarred, and unwanted. But when a rugged cowboy named Jace Callahan laid down just $3, destiny shifted. What no one knew that day was that this beaten-down horse carried a secret buried deep in the hills, one that would turn rejection into fortune and despair into hope. Where are you watching this from right now? Leave me a comment below. May your day be blessed with kindness. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next incredible story. The sun burned hot over Bitter Creek, a small town clinging to dust and stubborn will. Streets lay quiet, but the auction yard roared with voices. Men leaned on rails, silver dollars jingled, and horses tossed their heads under the weight of judgment. It was a day when fortunes shifted on the swing of a hammer. Jace Callahan pushed through the crowd, tall and broad-shouldered, every step steady. At 32, years of ranch work had carved muscle onto his frame. His face carried the mark of wind and sun, jaw square beneath a shadow of stubble. Pale blue eyes studied everything, calm but alert. Beside him walked Onyx, his black Mustang Stallion. 10 years old, strong as tempered steel, scar on his shoulder from a storm long past. Jace kept the bossel short, guiding him carefully. A stallion in a crowd was no toy, and Jace knew how to handle power. Sheriff Walt Danner leaned on the rail nearby, his silver mustache bristling. Age had softened his waistline, but not his eyes. Those brown eyes had once watched Jace's father ride the range, and the memory still weighed on him. Walt nodded, low voice carrying, "Don't throw money after something already lost." At the far edge of the yard stood a Chestnut Mustang. His coat, once red-brown, had dulled to rust. Ribs pressed sharp against his hide, his mane a tangle, his right ear torn. Scars marked his legs like maps of old cruelty. He barely lifted his head, as though waiting to be forgotten. Rachel Vaughn stood across the pen, elegant in her dark jacket and polished boots. Her green eyes, cold and precise, kept slipping from the horses to the red hills beyond town. Her clerk carried a leather tube of rolled surveys. Rachel's smile was thin, the kind that saw profits where others saw ruin. Derek Alden, lean and sharp, tipped his hat at Jace with a smirk. "That bag of bones, you'll bury him before the frost." Derek owed Rachel money and bent easily to her plans. His words always carried more pride than kindness. The auctioneer, Silas Boone, raised his voice. "Lot 43, Chestnut Mustang gelding, hard miles, no reserve. Who'll give me 15? Silence. 10? 5? The crowd shifted, uninterested. Feed was dear this year. No one wasted hay on a hopeless mouth. 3? Silas asked at last. A chuckle rippled through the men. Then Jace lifted his hand. His voice was steady. 3. Laughter burst. Someone muttered, "Fool's bargain." Derek shook his head, enjoying the spectacle. At that moment, the Chestnut raised his head. His amber eyes met Jace's across the dust. In them was not defeat, but intelligence, something sharp, alive, waiting. Jace felt the spark catch. Silas slammed his hammer. "Sold. $3 to Callahan." Rachel's lips curled in secret amusement. Derek spat in the dirt. Walt only sighed, as if watching history repeat, but Jace stepped forward, rope in hand, calm as stone. He touched the Mustang's neck, speaking low. "Easy, boy. You've got fire yet." Onyx lowered his head a rail away, breathing out softly. The Chestnut's ears flicked, his poll loosened, and for a heartbeat he shared a breath of truce. Jace looked into him and thought of rust and fire. The name was waiting. Derek leaned close with mockery. "When he breaks you, I'll buy him cheap." Jace's voice was quiet but sharp. "If he breaks anything, Derek, it'll be your smug smile." Walt stepped nearer, warning low. "Eyes are on you, son. Some to laugh, some to take. I rode fence with your father once. Keep your doors locked, storms are coming." Beyond the pens, 2 men in fine coats studied a map, glancing often toward the hills. Rachel's gaze followed. The Chestnut, too, once outside the yard, planted his hooves and turned his eyes to the ridge. Onyx pricked his ears the same way, as if both Mustangs shared a secret. Thunderheads stacked on the horizon, dark blue and heavy. Jace tugged the rope gently. "Not tonight," he murmured. "Tonight you'll drink slow, hay in small bites, no grain till morning. Tomorrow we see what you're pointing at." The horse blinked once and stepped forward. Jace, Onyx, and the battered Chestnut walked into the lengthening shadows, with thunder rolling like a drum far away. Evening came slow to Bitter Creek, the kind of evening that smelled of sage and storm. The last noise of the auction yard faded behind Jace Callahan as he swung into Onyx's saddle, the black stallion stepping light though muscle rippled under his hide. Rustfire, the chestnut gelding bought for $3, came along on a long lead, head turning not toward the trail home but to the dark ridge of hills north of town. The storm still brooded there, lightning flashing silent across the horizon, and both Mustangs felt it in their bones. Onyx moved with discipline, every stride measured, ears swiveling at thunder. Jace kept the bosal short, one rein giving reminders bend, yield, breathe, so power stayed quiet. He left a rail of space between black and chestnut, respect first, trust later. Rustfire was raw-boned, ribs showing sharp, but his focus never wavered. 3 times already he had stopped dead, ears pricked to the ridge, nostrils flaring toward the Bitter Creek hills. Jace leaned in the saddle, voice calm. "Not tonight, Rustfire. Tomorrow, maybe." The name came as natural as breath, born from the ember glint in those eyes that turned always toward the hills. Lightning cracked again, nearer this time. Onyx shortened his stride. Rustfire feathered his steps, ears skimming the sky with each rumble. Jace steadied both with the weight of his hand, but inside he filed the pattern away. Chestnut stops, black echoes, the ridge waiting. He thought of his father and how the old man had trusted stock more than maps, and wondered what he would say now. Behind them, the last wagons rolled slow, lanterns bobbing toward town. Further back, Rachel Vaughn rode a sleek gray mare along the ridge track. She did not ride in his dust. Instead, she chose higher ground for a cleaner line of sight. The mare was shod soft, steps muffled, and Ellis Dobb, her young clerk, steadied a hooded lantern half-shuttered against his vest. Rachel's figure sat tall, gloved hands easy, her green eyes watching Jace more than the road. She was 38, slim and composed, cheekbones cut sharp as stone, her face handsome rather than soft. Years of inheritance battles and land barters had scoured away warmth, leaving calculation in its place. "Keep note of where that horse stares," she murmured to Ellis. The young man, thin, nervous, spectacles flashing in the hooded light, nodded quick and scribbled on his pad. Rachel's lips curved faintly, not in humor, but in understanding. She knew the gaps in the old plats, the places maps blinked where a seam could sit outside a claim line by an inch yet buy a life outright. If Callahan's Mustang pointed to such a gap, she intended to know it. The road bent through cottonwoods, their leaves whispering in the storm breeze. Jace paused by a shallow creek, letting Rustfire sip. Too much water too fast, and a starved horse could colic, so he kept the rope short, letting the gelding drink in slow pulls. Rustfire's muzzle was soft against his palm, his thirst deep but measured. Onyx stood above, black coat shining even in dim light, ears turning to every sound. An older rancher, Tom Greeley, rode by with a lantern tied to his horn, wiry frame bent with 65 years of dust and labor. "That nag won't see winter, Callahan," he rasped. "Better off burning your money." Jace smiled faintly. "Sometimes bones carry more than flesh shows." Greeley snorted and rode on, words fading, but Rachel, on the ridge, heard every syllable. It confirmed her suspicion. What others dismissed, she would watch. As the trail climbed a shallow grade, the town lamps disappeared behind. The air grew colder, storm gusts carrying the metallic tang of rain. Once more Rustfire stopped, planting hooves in the dirt, ears sharp to the jagged outline of the Bitter Creek hills. He gave a low whinny, not broken as in the auction pen, but strong, insistent. Onyx answered with a rumble, striking the ground once. Jace sighed, pulling the rope taut. "Easy now. Tomorrow you'll show me. Tonight you'll eat, drink, and stand." That same ember look flared again in Rustfire's eyes, and Jace felt the name he had spoken earlier settle into place. It was not invention, but recognition. A third time the gelding set his gaze on the ridge, and again Onyx echoed. Jace filed the pattern where a man keeps the things that wake him early. They reached the Callahan spread after nightfall, clouds swallowing stars. Jace led both horses into the leaning barn, lamplight flickering on warped boards. Rustfire took slow pulls from a bucket of clean water, chewed a half flake of hay, ignored the grain. Jace picked burrs from the chestnut's tail, ran a hand down each fetlock, checking for heat or cracks. No grain, no heroics. Onyx shifted in his stall, restless but loyal, eyes rolling once at a thunderclap before settling. Rustfire moved to the back wall, head turned to the hills beyond. Jace leaned on the stall door, arms folded, hat tipped low. He whispered, "Tomorrow, boy, we'll see what waits." Rustfire pawed once, then stilled, his amber gaze fixed on the ridge as if seeing something no map could mark. Outside, thunder rolled again, closer, rattling the boards of the old barn. High on the opposite ridge, Rachel drew her mare to a halt. From that public ground a lawful mile away, she watched the glow of Callahan's lamp flicker through gaps in the barn wall. Her posture was still, but her thoughts worked fast. That Mustang had turned 3 times toward the Bitter Creek hills, and Callahan had noticed. She would notice too. The board was set, and the game had begun. She touched the reins, and the gray mare turned into the storm-dark night. Morning in Bitter Creek came gray and damp, the storm having passed but leaving the air heavy with the scent of sage and wet earth. Jace Callahan pushed open the barn door, coffee steaming in one hand, expecting to hear the quiet shifting of 2 horses. Instead, silence. Onyx snorted from his stall, ears pitched forward, but Rustfire's corner stood empty. The hemp lead was ragged with tooth marks, a cribber's work, and the wooden latch, swelled soft by storm damp, had slipped its peg. The chestnut was gone, and not by accident. Jace set the cup down untouched, the knot in his stomach tight as the reins in his hands. He saddled fast, throwing rope, canteen, a box of matches, and a thin blade knife into the saddlebag. Onyx shifted beneath him, restless, black muscles quivering as though he too had felt the absence. Out in the yard, the prints were plain fresh hooves pressed deep in the softened earth, angled north toward the Bitter Creek hills. Jace ground-tied Onyx long enough to check the sign, then swung up, keeping the bozel short in a span of space between Black and Chestnut Trail. He touched the brim of his hat low, muttering, "We'll find him, boy," and urged the stallion forward. The trail wound quick out of the valley, damp clay clinging to hooves, junipers dripping from last night's storm. Loose scree forced him to dismount, leading Onyx by the bozel, his boots crunching careful, the stallion following with iron calm. Higher up, a glimpse of Chestnut flashed against the ridgeline, then vanished into folds of stone. Rustfire's tracks led straight as a rifle shot, no wandering, no hesitation. Jace read them like scripture, a horse with purpose, not fear. After an hour, the sun split the clouds, white light slicing across the Bitter Creek hills. They rose ragged, ribs of stone and scattered pine, littered with the skeletons of old claims. Timbers black with age, a rusted boiler collapsed in a wash, rails bent to nowhere. Jace felt his throat dry, the land whispering of men who had chased silver until it swallowed them whole. Ahead, Rustfire stood still on a ledge, chestnut hide glowing damp, ears locked on the slope beyond. Jace pressed Onyx up, dismounted again, and watched as the gelding stepped forward into a narrow chute between boulders, head bent low, as if remembering the path. The chute ended in a fall of rock. Half buried beneath lay timbers, squared and weathered, their lines too straight to be nature's work. A rusted spike still bit one beam, and a splinter of a dynamite crate lay half buried, the letters MER ghosted in black. From below rose a smell-damp rock and old timber with a metallic tang, like a coin warmed too long in a palm. Rustfire pawed once, deliberate, striking sparks of gravel, and looked back at Jace with that same ember-lit gaze he'd shown in the auction yard. Jace ground-tied Onyx and tied Rustfire loose to a pinon branch, then knelt by the beams. His hand traced the outline of a trapdoor, edges buried under decades of scree. The storm had scoured the slope clean, peeling back just enough earth to show the squared wood. His pulse kicked. Here was a mouth unopened, a secret buried where maps had gone blank. He set his shoulder against a beam, testing, when a voice cut the air. "Callahan," came the steady drawl. "Best step back from that hole." Sheriff Walt Danner rode up slow on a bay gelding, posture straight despite his 60 years. He was broad through the chest, mustache thick and silvering, brown eyes steady under the brim of a weathered hat. His badge caught the sun against a dark duster coat, but it was the weight of his gaze that halted Jace more than iron or law. He dismounted, boots crunching, one hand resting loose near his holster but not threatening. "Walt," Jace said, brushing dust from his palms. "My horse led me here." Twice now he's pointed the same way. "You telling me to walk off when fate drops a door in front of me?" The sheriff's eyes flicked to Rustfire, ribs sharp but stance proud, as if claiming the find himself. Danner shook his head, voice lower. "Animals got instincts, sure, but instincts don't hold beams when they rot, nor keep gas from choking you blind. I've seen these hills bury men alive. Your father knew it too, and I promised him once I'd keep you from holes that don't spit men back." The words hit harder than stone. Jace straightened, jaw tight, but his eyes stayed on the beams. The sheriff stepped closer, running a hand along the timber, dust clinging to his fingers. "Storm washed this open, that's all. Tomorrow another slide could close it for good, or close it on you." He let the dust fall, gaze steady. "If you aim to dig, you do it right with braces, lamps, men who know their craft. Not alone. Not today." Wind rattled the loose boards, sending a breath of metallic dust into their faces. Onyx shifted, ears uneasy. Rustfire struck once more at the earth, sharp and insistent. Jace's chest ached with the pull, the same pattern as the night before, only louder. Chestnut pointing, Black agreeing, and now the hills answering with a door. He wanted to shove aside the scree, to light a match, and see what no map dared mark. But Danner's shadow stood between him and the dark. Jace exhaled slow, the fight still burning but rained. He tipped his hat. "Reckon you're right, Sheriff. No sense dying on the first day." Yet his eyes lingered on the squared timber, promise thrumming beneath. The sheriff swung back into the saddle, his bay shifting under him, and gave Jace a final look. "Remember, boy silver's no good to a dead man." He turned, riding down the slope, dust hanging long in the morning air. Jace untied Rustfire, laid a hand on the gelding's neck, feeling the strength hidden under the gaunt frame. He whispered, "Tomorrow, with braces, a lamp, and another set of hands. Not today, not blind." Rustfire shook his mane, eyes still fixed on the buried beams. Onyx snorted, pulling against the bosal as if to agree. As Jace led both horses down the path, he caught a mark in the dirt narrow hoof prints, lighter than Rustfire's, washed thin by the storm but there all the same. A gray mare's track, high on the ridge, fading but recent. He glanced once toward the horizon where the trail bent, then turned back to his own. The hills waited, patient and silent, their mouths sealed in stone, while man and horse carried the secret down to the valley floor. The morning after the storm dawned clear, the hills of Bitter Creek shining pale under a rinsed sky, the air crisp with the smell of damp earth and pine. Jace Callahan led his two Mustangs up a narrow ridge trail, Onyx steady as iron on the lead, Rustfire following behind with the twitchy eagerness of a horse who seemed to know the way. Sheriff Danner's warning echoed in Jace's memory. Not alone, not rushed, yet the promise of what lay hidden under the rocks burned stronger than caution. By mid-morning, the three of them reached the half-buried timbers. Their squared edges revealed now that rain and runoff had washed away part of the scree. Rustfire pawed and snorted, his ribs still thin, but his eyes alive with fire. Jace dismounted, ground-tied Onyx on a long rope that gave the stallion room to move, and loosely snubbed Rustfire to a low pinon. With a crowbar and a miner's lantern slung at his belt, he set to work hauling stones away, sweat darkening his shirt as his muscles strained against the stubborn rubble. At last he cleared enough to find a squared post and the black seam of a door, its hinges groaning as he pried it open. He wedged 2 oak braces under the first beams, tied a safety rope to a stout timber, and tested each rung of the ladder with his boot heel. The wood groaned but held, and slowly he lowered himself into the shadow, the lantern trembling in his hand. 20 feet down his boots struck packed dirt. The air was heavy with age, cool, dry, and stale. The lantern's glow spread across the stone walls and made Jace's breath catch in wonder. Silver ran through the rock in thick, bright seams like frozen lightning captured in stone. It was not a trace or a rumor, but a vein, wide and heavy, worth more than he had ever dreamed. Near the back wall lay canvas bags stacked in a line, some torn and spilling their contents. Silver dollars glimmered in the dust, tarnished but solid, the weight of them undeniable when Jace picked one up. The sealed air had hardened the cloth, but the coins sang in his palm like a chorus of stars. Above the stack, a message had been cut into a beam, the initials J.M., 1847, and beneath them a desperate warning. They come. Hide the deeds. God help the finder. A chill ran along Jace's arms, his excitement tempered by dread. Whoever J.M. had been, he had hidden more than silver here, and left his words like a ghost in the wood. Jace filled a small pouch with coins, enough to prove the truth, then forced himself to turn away. The rest he left untouched, knowing too much too soon could damn a man as quickly as it could save him. He climbed back up, dragging the scree over the entrance and covering it with brush, vowing to return with help when the time was right. The world above had turned restless. Onyx reared within the circle of his rope, hooves striking at the air, his scream sharp as steel. Rustfire tugged and stamped, his ears pinned, eyes rolling white. From the tree line poured 5 gray wolves, lean, matted, their ribs sharp from hunger, driven down by the storm that had scattered the game. They moved in a half-circle, yellow eyes fixed, lips curled back to bare their teeth. Onyx braced, every muscle alive, his neck snaking as he struck out. The first wolf lunged, and iron-shod hooves crashed against its ribs, sending it yelping into the dust. Another rushed from the flank, but Onyx spun inside his rope's circle, biting and striking, keeping the pack at bay. Rustfire, pressed against the pine, trembled, but did not fold. In a burst of courage, he lashed out with a rear hoof that cracked the jaw of a wolf that had come too close, sending it skittering back with a broken cry. Jace seized his rifle from the scabbard, fired one shot wide into the ground, the crack booming across the slope. The sound tore through the hungry silence, and the wolves, shocked and bloodied, faltered. Growls turned to whines, and one by one they slunk back into the brush, glaring with hate but unwilling to test the fury of horses and gunfire again. When silence fell, only the rasp of breath remained. Jace ran to Rustfire first, stroking the Chestnut's sweat-dark neck, whispering, "Easy, boy, you're safe." Then he pressed his forehead to Onyx's, murmuring thanks into the black stallion's tangled mane. Rustfire's ears flicked forward, and Onyx touched his muzzle briefly to the Chestnut's, a rough promise forged in dust and danger. Jace gathered his gear, tied down the coins in his saddlebag, and mounted Onyx. The stallion still blew hot but carried his rider steady, Rustfire trailing behind, gaunt but proud. The mine lay hidden once more, its wealth waiting, but Jace knew now that treasure came chained to risk, and that every step forward carried a price. Back in town, Rachel Vaughn stood at the window of Vaughn Land and Title, the late light turning her chestnut hair copper and her green eyes sharp as cut glass. 38 years had hardened her into something graceful yet unyielding. Her lean frame held stiff in a dark jacket that whispered of wealth just out of reach. Beside her, Ellis Dobb, her thin, spectacled clerk, read from his notes in a soft, reedy voice. Callahan bought oak braces, a miner's lantern and rope, Ellis said. All from Hiram Pike's general store, paid on credit. Rachel's lips curled into the barest smile, a flash of teeth more like a knife than warmth. She spread the old county plats across her desk, fingers pausing over a blank space between marked claims. "He has found something," she murmured, half to herself, half to Ellis. "And if he has found it, I will find a way to hold it." She closed the ledger, her gaze sliding back to the hills, patient and calculating, like a spider watching the first tremor on her web. Jace rode home through the dusk, the weight of silver pressing heavy in his saddlebag, the weight of what he had seen pressing heavier still in his heart. He had survived the wolves, uncovered the truth, and hidden it again. For now it was his secret alone, yet already the world seemed to lean closer, waiting to take its share. The night hung low over Bitter Creek, the stars sharp and brittle in the black expanse above, the prairie grass whispering beneath a restless wind. Jace Callahan had settled into the silence of his ranch, finishing the last chores in the barn, oiling his saddle, and checking the locks. Onyx stood tall and steady in his stall, black coat shimmering with the faint sheen of moonlight, while Rustfire shifted restlessly, his chestnut hide streaked with shadows, eyes flicking often toward the distant hills. The air felt thick, heavy, as though the ground itself waited for something to ignite. The first flicker came quietly, a smear of orange along the fence line, then another that hissed as it licked the dry wood. Within minutes, flames spread hungry and fast, embers rolling across the grass like fireflies gone mad. From the dark ridge above, Rachel Vaughn watched with a hard smile, her face shadowed beneath the wide brim of a hat, green eyes gleaming in the light of destruction she had ordered. At her side sat Tully Brand, her foreman, a square-shouldered man of 40, with a scar that ran along his jawline, his eyes flat with obedience. It was he who raised a gloved hand, signaling the riders forward, their torches cutting arcs of fiery light as they rushed the Callahan ranch. Rachel did not lower herself to cast a torch. She preferred to remain unseen, the hand behind the strike, not the one that bore the flame. Beside her, Ellis Dobb hunched nervously on a mule. Ledger clutched under his coat, the pale lines of fear etched deep in his face. He had once hoped to make a quiet fortune through Rachel's schemes, but tonight the violence unsettled him, his thin frame shrinking under her command. "Ma'am," he whispered, "the sheriff won't stand for this." Rachel's reply was cold and sharp. "By the time Danner stirs, there will be nothing left for him to protect." In the yard, the fire leapt higher, licking at the fence and running toward the barn. Rustfire screamed and kicked his stall, ears flat and eyes rolling white. Onyx slammed against his gate, hooves striking the wood like gunfire, the smoke making his nostrils flare wide. Jace burst from the farmhouse, boots pounding the dirt, rifle clutched in his hands. The smell of burning timber filled his lungs, his eyes stinging from the smoke as he cut across the yard and threw open the barn doors. Rustfire bolted into the night, and Onyx thundered behind him, but instead of fleeing, the black stallion wheeled around and planted himself squarely between Jace and the blaze, as if daring the fire itself to advance. The riders swept in, circling the house, shouting curses as they threw their torches against the walls. Jace fired a shot wide into the dirt, the crack splitting the night. One rider's horse shied, bucking sideways, the torch falling harmless into the dust. Onyx lunged, hooves flashing as he knocked another man's weapon from his hand, while Rustfire stamped down a trail of burning straw that threatened to catch the hay. Jace rushed to the porch, grabbing buckets and sloshing water over the flames, his arms burning with the weight, his shirt clinging with sweat and smoke. Rachel's plan, built on fear, began to splinter as the animals and their master fought back with desperate coordination. On the ridge, she clenched her jaw, fury twisting her features. Tully shouted again, pushing the men forward, but already some of them faltered, uncertain beneath the defiance blazing from the ranch below. It was then that the town stirred, awakened not by rumor, but by the sight of flames licking against the sky. Maybelle Ortiz, keeper of the boarding house, had rung the old iron triangle until it howled through the streets. Sheriff Walt Danner answered the call, broad-shouldered and resolute, riding at the head of 6 townsfolk armed with buckets, blankets, and shotguns. They stormed into the yard like a tide, the sheriff's voice rolling deep and commanding. "Enough! This ends now!" Buckets flew hand to hand, water soaking the porch, blankets smothering sparks on the roof, the people of Bitter Creek forming a line that matched the fire's fury with human will. Jace joined them, shoulder to shoulder, passing water until his arms ached. Onyx pacing beside the men with his head high, Rustfire trembling but steadfast as he guarded the barn door. Rachel's riders wavered, their courage stripped by the sudden strength of the townsfolk, their torches sputtering as the fire was beaten back. Rachel's eyes blazed, her pride burning hotter than the flames she had lit, but she knew when a battle was lost. With a flick of her reins, she wheeled her horse, Ellis clinging behind her, his face pale as parchment. One rider lingered too long, and in the glare of firelight, Jace saw the flash of an Alden family concho on his saddle, a whisper of another hand in the shadows of Rachel's schemes. But the man vanished into the night before the thought could settle. Sheriff Danner swung down from his saddle, his silver mustache bristling, brown eyes steady as fence posts in the wind. He planted a hand on Jace's shoulder, voice low but firm. "You've earned more than silver here tonight. You've earned the trust of Bitter Creek." Around them, soot-streaked faces nodded in agreement, voices murmuring support, their presence a shield stronger than any wall. The last embers hissed into smoke, the fire beaten, but its lesson carved into every soul who stood there. Rachel had sought to destroy a man's livelihood with flame and fear, but she had kindled something far stronger: unity. Jace stood amid the smoldering remains of the night, his body aching, his lungs raw. But in his chest a new weight settled, not of coins or silver, but of loyalty freely given. Onyx pressed his muzzle against Jace's arm, dark eyes steady, while Rustfire lifted his head high, his gaunt body scarred by ash but spirit unbroken. Under the stars, with smoke drifting like ghosts across the prairie, Jace understood that his fight was no longer his alone. The town had chosen him, and with that choice came a bond that no fire could burn away. Morning returned to Bitter Creek like a promise kept, the air washed clean after the fire, the prairie smelling of sage and cooling ash. The town had stood with Jace Callahan when it mattered, and as the embers faded, a different heat took hold, the steady burn of work well planned. At first light, he rode the ridge with Sheriff Walt Danner, filing the last papers that made his claim lawful, then turned home with a list of what must be built before a single pick struck stone. The future would come by timber, rope, air, and patience, not by luck. The mouth of the old mine was opened again without fanfare, brush cleared and the slope cribbed tight, the first chamber braced with treated oak and iron dogs set where the beams met rock. Jace ordered a bell hung at the entrance and a tally board chalked with every name that went below, each line erased only when the man returned to daylight. He paid a carpenter to rig a wind scoop and canvas ducting so fresh air pushed through the galleries, and he carried a tin of canary feathers on his belt as a poor man's barometer that he checked twice before he checked once more. When the first crew stepped under the square of sky, the rhythm they carried was careful rather than eager, a music of survival that made the silver wait its turn. Word traveled beyond the valley, and men came not for adventure, but for wages that arrived on Saturdays without argument. Jace did not hire anyone he would not eat beside, and he did not send a man where he would not go himself. The Penhaligon brothers from Cornwall showed up with quiet voices and hard hands, Tom compact and broad through the chest, Jonah taller with a miner's lamp scar on his brow, both wearing the cautious expressions of men who had lost friends to bad ground. Jace listened more than he spoke, and in the listening his crew learned that Prophet was a guest invited to the table after Safety had taken the head chair. Sheriff Danner did his part in sunlight where law belongs, posting the claim notice at the courthouse and riding the ridges each week so no one could pretend confusion about boundaries. He walked the head frame with Jace on a cold morning, silver frost smoking off their breaths, and said what a good sheriff should say, that order was the spine that keeps a town from folding in on itself. When a drifter tried to pocket ore at the mouth of the shaft, Walt took him aside with a hand on the shoulder and a voice that explained without shouting that Bitter Creek was no longer a place where taking came before asking. The man gave the rock back, then gave the town back its peace by moving on. The first ore drew bright across the sorting table, a gray stone laced with threads that caught the sun like wire pulled from lightning. Jace sampled, bagged, and shipped by wagon to the nearest smelter, keeping ledgers that would make any banker nod, then waiting through weeks of dust and rattle until the assay slip returned with numbers that tasted like iron and hope. Ingots came home on a freight wagon under canvas, stamped simple and heavy, and Jace locked them in a box whose key he kept in his pocket next to a small piece of rope chewed ragged by a Chestnut Mustang who refused to be forgotten. He paid his people first and himself last, and by the time he counted what remained, he found he was rich anyway. Bitter Creek did not bloom in a day, but it changed in honest increments that felt like sunrise. Winter was the test, cold threading through the cracks of clappered houses and ice stacking along the creek stones. Yet wages still arrived and no one went hungry. When spring came, the schoolhouse roof was reshingled and a new window hung straight, and Miss Ada Whitcomb, a Kansas woman in her late 20s with wheat hair tucked neat and a voice that could gentle boys without breaking their spirits, laid down slates on clean desks and rang a bell that sounded like ambition instead of warning. Maybelle Ortiz filled her boarding house by keeping coffee hot and stories warmer, and Hiram Pike at the general store began stocking books alongside nails because the town had learned to want both. Onyx and Rustfire settled into roles that suited bone and heart rather than burden, the black Mustang carrying Jace on paydays and parading into town with his head high, the Chestnut gelding meeting children at the fence with an old soul's patience that steadied small hands. They did not drag ore carts, and they did not pull beyond their pride, for they had other work that mattered more. On Saturdays, Jace let the miners' little ones loop ribbons through Rustfire's mane, and he let widowers with sore knees lean a moment on Onyx's shoulder without apology. In time, the two horses became the town's shorthand for courage, a living emblem stamped on memory more deeply than any coin mark. Rachel Vaughn passed from the landscape like weather that has blown itself out, her name mentioned only as a warning about what greed can do when it forgets how to count people. She sold the last of her parcels and left before winter finished biting, and the only trace of her ambition was a narrow space on the old plats where a boundary had nearly cut the town's future in half. Jace wasted no words on her, choosing to claim his revenge in bridges built, debts forgiven, and roofs mended before rain. The lesson she had meant to teach with fire turned at last into a charter for generosity. The mine had its scares, as every mine will, a soft spot in the hanging wall that muttered on a wet evening and a timber that complained until it was replaced. But prudence kept the worst from making itself known. Twice Jace closed a promising gallery because the ground talked in a language he would not pretend to understand, and twice the men shook his hand instead of cursing the lost silver because they had wives who would rather have husbands than coin. At year's end, he set aside a tenth for a common fund administered by a simple rule that even the hardest foreman could respect. If a need rises higher than pride, the town meets it before it falls. Summer brought celebration without sheepishness, a fair built of canvas and laughter, fiddles making air move, the smell of peach pies and the steady clack of horseshoes ringing true behind the blacksmith. Sheriff Danner stood on the boarding house steps with his hat under his arm and said in his plain way that a town proves itself by who it carries when the load gets heavy, and Bitter Creek had carried its own. Jace handed the marshal a sealed envelope for the widow's purse and another for the school, while Maybelle pinned a blue ribbon to Rustfire's bridle and a red one to Onyx's, claiming they were both champions and starting an argument no one wanted to end. The night lifted with their music, the sky so clear it seemed new. In the quiet after the dance, Jace walked the pasture fence and the horses shadowed him without being asked, hooves whispering through short grass. He ran a hand along the smooth arc of Onyx's neck and the warm line of Rustfire's jaw, remembering where the story had begun, a dusty pen, a $3 bid, a broken horse whose eyes still held a coal of faith. Wealth had found him, but it had not changed the size of his hands or the shape of his thanks. He breathed in the clean dark and let belonging settle where fear used to live. By autumn, the town had a doctor 2 days each week and a bridge stout enough to carry a freight wagon in flood, and there was a bell at the new chapel that rang softer than the iron triangle but could be heard farther. Children learned to read by daylight and to dance by lantern light, and a ledger at the general store recorded not only debt but the names of those who had paid another's bill without speaking of it. When strangers asked why Bitter Creek had turned from hard luck to good, the locals pointed with the same pride to 3 things: the steadiness of a man who shared rather than hoarded, the law that stayed even when the wind rose, and 2 Mustangs that had shown them how to stand their ground. It ended as such stories should, without trumpets and without fear. Silver continued to come up from the cool dark in measured weights that never outran judgment, and the money that followed traveled outward like a river that knows its banks. Jace kept living where he had started, in a house that did not grow much larger but grew warmer with friends, and the pastures held 2 figures whose shadows at sunset stretched long and certain across the grass. Onyx and Rustfire raised their heads when the evening breeze moved, catching the scent of rain and memory, and Bitter Creek breathed with them, a town made whole by the quiet bravery of choosing one another. In the end, Jace's journey reminds us of something far greater than silver or fortune. It shows us the quiet miracle of God's hand at work, how he can take what the world rejects and turn it into a blessing, just as he took a broken horse and a weary man and made them symbols of hope for an entire town. In our everyday lives, we too face trials that seem impossible, but when we hold on to faith, when we choose kindness over greed and courage over fear, we open the door for God's grace to shine through. If this story touched your heart, share it with others so they may also find strength in it. Leave a comment below, and if you believe in the miracle of God's love, write Amen in the comments. Do not forget to subscribe to the channel for more stories that inspire the soul. May the Lord bless you and keep you safe in every step you take.